Here is a question that most people in their 50s are too ashamed to ask out loud, not because they do not know the answer might be uncomfortable, but because asking it out loud makes it real in a way that keeping it inside does not. The question is this: if I am 50 years old and I have effectively nothing saved for retirement, is there still a path forward, or have I already missed it? Nearly 1 in 3 Americans between the ages of 45 and 59 have nothing saved for retirement. Not a small amount. Not an amount they are embarrassed by. Nothing. And the majority of them have quietly concluded that the window has closed, that the math no longer works in their favor, and that the most honest thing they can do is accept that retirement, as most people describe it, is simply not going to be their story. So, they stop thinking about it. They stop looking at the numbers. They root the anxiety into other parts of their life and they keep moving. That decision, the decision to stop, is the most expensive decision most of them will ever make. Not because the situation is not serious, it is serious, but because the difference between a difficult retirement and a genuinely impossible one is almost entirely determined by what a person does in the first 2 or 3 years after they finally open the drawer and look at the number. There is a man I will call Gerald. He is 51 years old when this story begins. Gerald spent his career in logistics management. He earned a solid middle income for most of his adult life, raised a family in a house he mostly paid for, and handled the immediate obligations of his life with reasonable competence. What he did not handle was the long-term one. Every year there was something that made the retirement contribution feel optional. A car that needed replacing, a kid in college, a period where the income dropped and rebuilding the emergency fund felt more urgent than funding an account he would not touch for 15 years. And then 15 years became 12, and 12 became 8. And at 51, Gerald sat down with a piece of paper and wrote the number at the top and stared at it for a long time. The number was not 0. There was something in an old workplace account from a job he had left in his early 40s. When he calculated what that amount would realistically produce as monthly retirement income, it covered approximately his cable bill. Everything else, the rent, the food, the medications that were already becoming a line item, that was all uncovered. I want to use Gerald's story as the frame for everything that follows today, because the question in the title deserves a real answer. Not a motivational answer, not a catastrophizing answer, a real one. And real answers require real people at the center of them. The first thing worth understanding about Gerald's situation, and about the situation of anyone who arrives at 50 with this particular problem, is that the retirement savings number is only one part of the financial picture. It is the part that causes the panic. It is not the whole story. When someone sits down at 50 and sees a retirement account that reads effectively 0, the emotional response that number produces tends to collapse everything else in the financial picture into that single data point. The house disappears, the earning capacity disappears, the social security history disappears, the skills and professional relationships that could generate income for another 20 years disappear. All that remains in the field of vision is the number that should be large and is not. The first step that actually changes outcomes, the step that separates the Geralds who find a path from the ones who do not, is an honest and complete inventory of everything that does not appear in that retirement account, but that is genuinely part of the financial picture. Gerald owned a house. He had been paying the mortgage for 19 years. The equity in that property was substantial, not a fortune, but real money. Money that represented decades of payments and appreciation, and a choice he had made in his 30s that turned out to be one of the better financial decisions of his life, even though he had never thought of it in those terms. That equity was an asset. It was not liquid in the way a brokerage account is liquid, but it was real, and it was his, and it changed the calculation. Gerald also had a professional background in logistics that was worth something in the market independent of his primary employer. The network he had built over a 25-year career, the problems he knew how to solve, the relationships that trusted his judgment. These things had market value, not the kind of value that shows up on a net worth statement, but the kind that can produce income in parallel with a primary job if the decision is made to structure things that way. And Gerald had a social security statement he had not looked at in years. When he finally pulled it up, the projected benefit at 67 was more meaningful than he expected. Not enough to live on independently, but enough to serve as a foundation that changed what the rest of the plan needed to accomplish. This inventory, the house, the earning capacity, the social security number, does not solve the problem, but it reframes it. The problem is not starting from zero. The problem is starting from an incomplete picture and making decisions based on the part that produces the most fear rather than the whole. Now here is where it gets harder, because the inventory is the easy part. What comes after it is the conversation that most financial content avoids, because it is uncomfortable, and because it requires saying something that sounds harsh, even when it is genuinely meant to help. If you are 50 years old with nothing saved, the path forward almost certainly involves a serious renegotiation with your current lifestyle. Not a minor adjustment, not cutting the streaming subscriptions and calling it discipline. A genuine examination of what your life actually costs versus what it needs to cost, and a willingness to close that gap aggressively for the next 10 to 15 years. Here is what gets observed consistently in the people who manage to turn this situation around. The ones who make real progress are not universally the ones with the highest incomes. They're the ones who make a decision, a real decision, not a vague intention, about the gap between what they earn and what they spend. And then they protect that gap, the way someone protects something valuable, because it is valuable. Every dollar that goes into that gap rather than into the life that was being lived before has approximately 15 years to compound before retirement. At a historically reasonable market return, money that is invested consistently over 15 years has the potential to more than double. The math is not miraculous, but it is real, and it requires a gap to work with. Gerald's audit of his monthly expenses produced a number that surprised him. Not because he was reckless, he was not reckless, but because the accumulation of reasonable individual decisions had produced an aggregate monthly cost that left almost nothing available for anything else. The car payment that made sense when it was signed, the insurance packages that had been renewed without review, the membership fees for things that had drifted from active use to ambient presence. When Gerald went through every line with the question of whether this expenditure was necessary or habitual, the number that emerged was uncomfortable, and then it became available. The second practical element that changes outcomes for people in Gerald's situation is the catch-up contribution rules that the government has put in place specifically for people over 50. This is one of the areas where the system has actually done something useful, and most people who need it most do not know it exists. Once a person turns 50, the IRS allows contributions to retirement accounts that exceed the standard annual limits. The additional amount that can be directed into a 401k or similar workplace account beyond the standard limit is meaningful. The additional catch-up for an IRA adds further capacity. The combined effect for someone who can direct a significant portion of their income toward these accounts in the years between 50 and 65 is a savings trajectory that can produce a number that is not comfortable, but is workable. The key word is consistently, not heroically, not with extraordinary luck, consistently over the full 15 years without interruption. Gerald did not max out his catch-up contributions in year one. That was not realistic for him. What he did was establish an automatic contribution that was uncomfortable, but survivable. Set it to increase by a small percentage each year, tied to any income increases, and commit to not touching it under any circumstances that did not involve a genuine emergency. That discipline, held for 12 years, produced a number that would not fund the retirement he had imagined at 30. But it funded a retirement that was real, that was his, that did not require him to keep working at 72 out of necessity. The third element is the Social Security decision, which is one of the most consequential choices available to someone in Gerald's situation, and one of the most commonly made badly. The Social Security system is structured so that the age at which a person begins claiming benefits has a permanent effect on the monthly amount they receive for the rest of their life. Claiming at 62 produces a reduced benefit that stays reduced. Claiming at 67, the full retirement age for most people in this generation, produces the standard benefit. But waiting beyond 67, up to age 70, produces a benefit that increases by approximately 8% for every year of delay past full retirement age. Over a retirement that lasts 20 or 25 years, the difference between claiming at 62 and waiting until 70 can amount to a genuinely significant sum of money. For someone in Gerald's situation, this lever is particularly important because the Social Security benefit is the part of the retirement income that does not depend on having saved enough. It is based on the earnings history. For someone who worked and earned a reasonable income for 30 years, that benefit is often larger than they expect, and the decision about when to claim it, which requires thinking carefully about health, about other income sources, about the ability to cover expenses in the years between retirement and 70, is a decision worth taking seriously, rather than defaulting to the earliest possible date because the money is available. Gerald waited. He worked 2 years longer than he had originally planned, covering his expenses with a combination of his primary income and a consulting arrangement he had built on the side. He claimed Social Security at 69. The monthly benefit he received was meaningfully larger than what he would have received at 62. That difference, paid monthly for the remainder of his life, changed what the rest of his finances needed to accomplish. The fourth element is the one that most financial content treats as secondary, but that the people who actually navigate this situation successfully treat as primary. It is the question of where and how you live. The cost of a retirement is not fixed. It is a function of choices. Choices about geography, about housing, about what a good day actually requires in terms of expenditure. A person who retires in a high cost of living city with a lifestyle built around that city's pricing structure needs a fundamentally different financial base than a person who has thought carefully about what they actually want from their days and structured the cost of those days accordingly. What gets observed in the people who come through situations like Gerald's with genuine dignity is that at some point in their 50s, they had a conversation with themselves about what they actually wanted, not what they had been performing wanting for the benefit of their social context, what they genuinely wanted. And in almost every case, the genuine answer was simpler and less expensive than the performed one. Not impoverished, not deprivation, just honest. A smaller house in a place with a lower cost of living. A life organized around the things that actually produced satisfaction rather than the things that signaled it to others. Gerald moved, not dramatically, not across the country. He moved from the city where he had built his career to a smaller town 2 hours away, where his dollar went meaningfully further, where the pace suited him better, and where the house he could afford to buy outright with the equity from his previous property freed him from a monthly housing payment entirely. That single decision changed his monthly income requirement in retirement by an amount that made everything else more manageable. Now I want to address the thing that sits underneath all of this, because the practical steps matter. The catch-up contributions and the Social Security timing and the expense audit and the equity strategy, these things matter, and they work. But what determines whether any of them actually get implemented is something that happens before the first practical step. It is the moment when a person decides whether the situation is too far gone to be worth engaging with. What gets observed in the people who make real progress from a position like Gerald's at 50 is not superior financial knowledge. It is not higher income. It is a specific decision made at a specific moment. The moment when the drawer gets opened and the number gets seen, and the person decides what to do with that information. The people who decide that the situation is hopeless and close the drawer again produce one outcome. The people who decide that the situation is serious but not finished and start from wherever they are produce a different one. Gerald was not a financial sophisticate. He did not make perfect decisions after 51. He made consistent ones. He stayed in the accounts even in the years when the market made him want to leave. He maintained the consulting work even when it was inconvenient. He had the conversation with himself about what he actually wanted from his later years, and he made the choices that matched the honest answer rather than the performed one. At 67, Gerald is not wealthy. He is not sitting on the retirement that someone who started at 25 with discipline and intention might have built. But he is not working out of necessity. He is not dependent on family. He is not lying awake calculating whether the month's expenses will fit the month's income. He has a life that is genuinely his, built on choices that he made in the decade and a half between opening the drawer and arriving at the other side. The answer to whether it is too late at 50 is not yes, and it is not a reassuring no. The honest answer is that it depends almost entirely on what happens in the first 6 months after the question gets asked. The window is real. The math is real. The path requires things that are genuinely difficult. But the alternative, the decision that the situation is hopeless and the drawer goes back in the closed position, that alternative produces an outcome that is certain rather than merely difficult. The train has not left the station, but it is not waiting indefinitely either. And the only question that matters right now is what you are going to do with the time that is still on the clock.